Hi, and welcome to Twitter Spaces event here, hosted by the Center for European Policy Analysis. I'm Maggie Miller. I am a cybersecurity reporter with Politico, and I'm really honored and happy to be here today talking with a couple really great panelists and Ukraine-Russia experts. We have Ivana Stradner, a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Barish Center for Media Integrity. Jakub Kolensky, a senior analyst at Hybrid COE. And we also have Andrei Soldatov, a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Thank you all for being here so much. I think we're going to have hopefully a great discussion today on various cybersecurity and disinformation concerns that we're seeing involved in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So I want to kick it off pretty quickly and pose this question to everybody on the call. But I suppose we can start with Ivana and then move on to Jakub and Andrei. Ahead of the invasion in February, various experts and officials were all warning of widespread, debilitating cyber attacks on Ukrainian and NATO infrastructure. And while we did indeed see some of these cyber attacks, such as on satellite provider Viasat and on at least attempted on Ukrainian energy infrastructure in April, we haven't seen the overall sort of successful publicly reported cyber attacks materialize. Why would you say this is the case? Was this something you expected to see? What are your thoughts on what we've seen so far? And again, I'll go to Ivana first.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Maggie, very much for and SIPA for organizing this a very important event on a pertinent topic related to information security. So when the invasion continued in February 2022, the first thing that I was monitoring was actually information security, both information operations and cybersecurity, because that's something that I was expecting because that was the part of the Russian playbook since 2014, because Russia is waging a hybrid war that is not only related to kinetic use of force, but also related to information security. And emphasizing the word information security because in Russian language, there is not even, in Russian military, they don't even use the word cybersecurity, use information operations. The reason why I'm emphasizing this is because it has two components. One is cybersecurity and the other one is information operations. So they are both integrated. So as you just mentioned, we did, see certain events in Ukraine, but we haven't seen something what everyone was expecting, in the West. And I have no doubt that countries in the West were prepared for such cyber attacks, and there were numerous, defensive measures that they took probably, in advance. But also, cybersecurity is an arena where things happen in deception, and I always like to emphasize: the less we know, the better. And we really don't know even what's happening, in the field. Russia was certainly, threatening. They will retaliate in cyberspace, but I also have no doubt that the United States took numerous precautionary measures. That's the first part of the story. The second part of the story is related to the second part of information security that deals with information operations. And that's something that Russia has been waging openly since 2014. And in 2022, we've seen even with pretexts and with false flag operations regarding fighting Nazism, fighting biolabs, making all those sorts of claims that I'm happy to expand later on to explain how they operate, that they've been waging on three different fronts, how I like to explain. One is inside Russia. The second part is what they've been doing, in the West. And in the third part, what I like to call in the rest, because while many, on Twitter has already declared that Russia has lost the information war. Maybe that's correct when we are talking about Twitter. However, Russia is quite successful and its information operations elsewhere, including Africa. Just we have to take a look what's happening with the grain disinformation and with food crisis, and how actually it really works inside Africa. I have to admit that the West has done numerous defensive measures in terms of sanctioning different Russian platforms, in terms of banning different Russian platforms that have been facilitating disinformation campaigns. But that's really also not enough, because I think that the United States, in particular in the European Union, should have done more in terms of offensive information operations. And I'm happy to speak about this later. So I just wanted to give an overview that both about the technical part related to cybersecurity, but also the psychological part of information operations, what I've noticed since February.
Great. Thanks, Ivana. And yeah, I'll go to Jakob next, posing the same question. Have you seen what you expected from Russia in terms of cyber and disinformation attacks against Ukraine? And why would you say maybe we haven't seen what was the worst case scenario expected prior to the February invasion?
Hello, and thank you for having me here. About the cyberspace, yeah, let me admit in the beginning, I do not really consider myself to be the top expert on cyber. I focus more on disinformation. However, just today or yesterday, there was this piece of news that the United Kingdom experts are actually helping Ukraine with the cyber attacks, and it didn't really sound like there is nothing going on. It rather sounds like there is a lot going on, just that Ukraine is quite successful in defending against these cyber attacks with the help of their Western partners. And we can see that Russia can be effective on other fronts. Like there is a huge cyber attack ongoing in Montenegro, I believe, since the end of August, and it was quite difficult to reach some of the government partners in that country. So apparently there was quite a successful cyber attack, and there are many other hybrid attacks in other domains. What was happening in the Baltic Sea with the Nord Stream, what was happening in Norway with the drones, or with the photographers of the sensitive areas. So I would say there's actually quite a lot going on, and hopefully the fact that we don't see something really negative happening in Ukraine in cyberspace means mainly that the help of international partners and the defense of Ukraine is sufficient to repel the attacks. I think it's a completely different topic when it comes to the disinformation. I would actually say that Russia is quite successful in the disinformation space. It is extremely troubling to see that in some European countries, 1/3 or even a bigger part of the population is persuaded that somehow it's the West to blame for the war in Ukraine. I believe it was 30% in Slovakia. It was even more in Greece and Bulgaria. Quite significant number in Hungary. It is troubling to see that some Western academics are still parroting the Russian lie that it is somehow NATO to blame for the invasion, even if we can clearly see that it is a nonsense. I'm currently living in Finland. Finland is entering NATO, and Russia doesn't annex Porvoo or doesn't annex Helsinki because it feels threatened by the having NATO on their doorstep. So you can see it's just a propaganda line, yet still some Western academics still keep parroting this Russian lie, and this Russian lie still makes it to the mainstream media. Even the solid media outlets in the West are sometimes still repeating Russian authorities as if what they have to say has any relevance. The lies about the pseudo-referenda in southeastern Ukraine, or after every attack and after mass grave discovery, this unfortunate model that Ukraine says this, but Russia says this. Or the recent statements by Putin during the Valdai Club that Russia is ready for negotiations, but Washington and Kiev don't want to. I mean, if you don't tell the readers that Russia has lied about everything they had done in the past 8 years, beginning with Crimea, shooting down MH17, poisoning of Skripal and Navalny, state-organized doping, war crimes in Syria and Ukraine, if you just present the Russian statements and do not warn the reader that it is a statement by a notorious liar, that's just misleading the readers, I'm afraid. And we can unfortunately see that it has an effect, be it the opinion polls that I mentioned, or the fact that the new owner of this platform where we speak is repeating some allegedly new peace plans that actually look like very much like the old Russian peace plans. So let me stop here for the beginning.
And then Andre, I want to head to you and see if you have any thoughts on what we've seen so far in this conflict, just to kick things off. Andre, are you available to speak? All right, we might come back to you, Andre, but in the meantime, I want to reference to an article that was out by Sky News this morning where they were talking about British cyber assistance to the UK, and with a government official claiming that Ukraine has indeed withstood major Russian cyber attacks because of not only their own defenders, but help from the international community, such as the UK. Ivana and Jakob and Andre, if you're able to speak,
yeah, I'm back.
Oh, hello, Andre. Perfect.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No.
My mic was off. It's my fault.
No
So if
worries.
I can, say something.
Yes, of course.
As a Russian investigative journalist, I spent quite a number of years investigating Russian cyber actors, and we, with my colleague Irina Bragan, just published a report for CIPA about Russian cyber offensive capabilities. So it's not a big secret that Russia has a lot in this field, and we are talking about at least 3 agencies, not to mention private actors and private companies and proxies helping sometimes the government in attacks. The problem is that we all expected a massive attack, cyber attack on Ukraine in the beginning of the conflict, and lots of people expected a massive attack on critical infrastructure, which never happened. So we saw some attacks. You're absolutely right, but nothing of the scale we expected. And one school of thought had it that, look, maybe Putin really believed in the idea that he could invade the country in 3 days, and he didn't want to destroy the infrastructure of the country because he wanted to save it for his troops. And that argument might be fine for 2-3 weeks, but I mean, in November, I don't think this argument holds. Because, look, even for Putin now, it's absolutely clear that it's not like some special military operation. It's a big war. And in this war, he didn't hesitate to attack civilian infrastructure by other means, by his airstrikes, for instance. And why he's not combining these attacks with cyber attacks? It's a big question mark. And the problem is that we understand that the military, especially, they have these capabilities to attack. So my only theory, which might help to explain why it's not going on right now, is that this war is still very far from a conventional one. And the chain of command, I would say, is not something you would expect from Russia to have it in a conventional war. What we have a huge political element being present at every stage of planning and executing this so-called special military operation, which is a war. And with cyber, it's even more evident. We see that despite the fact that the FSB, the SVRs, the military intelligence, all of them have cyber capabilities, nevertheless, a proper cyber command was never established in the country. We see that decisions about cyber operations are always taken on a political level. So we are talking about the Security Council, the administration of the president, the politicians, basically. Many of these people, they have security services background, but they are not military types. We see some attacks, some cyber attacks, some cyber activities on the battlefield. But I would say it's extremely tactical. So we see some attempts to hack drones used by the Ukrainians, but nothing bigger. So the big question is, why on the political level, right now, the Kremlin thinks that it's not an appropriate moment to launch a massive attack? And it also goes not only for cyber attacks, but also for disinformation attacks. Of course, we can argue that it would be difficult right now to sell the Kremlin narrative to the Ukrainians because, I mean, it's a war, it's an invasion. But we all know that for several years, the Kremlin has been built a massive infrastructure for running disinformation operations in Western Europe and in the United States. So why these networks were not properly activated? Why we see some operations only in Global South? And to be honest, we don't see a big push for the Kremlin narrative in the West. Again, it's a big question mark. I'm here just speculating, but maybe, just maybe, Putin is still afraid of uncontrollable escalation. So maybe there are still some people in the Kremlin who think, including Putin, that it's better to focus on attacking Ukraine right now and not to expand the whole thing to other countries. But maybe just my wishful thinking.
And we're going to expand out on some of that. But as I was just starting to ask, I know Sky News was publishing a report on British cyber assistance to Ukraine this morning, and government officials claiming that Ukraine has mostly withstood the attacks because of not only their own defenders, but because of help from the international community, such as the UK. What are your thoughts on this for any of the panelists in terms of what the impact of international, whether it be government assistance or the private IT army assistance that Ukraine has been given in terms of preventing some of these widespread cyber attacks that we expected to see that may well have been launched but just haven't had any impact for any of our three panelists to answer? And perhaps we can go to either Jakob or Ivana first.
Sure. Well, it's actually the piece I was referring to. I just probably read it somewhere else than CNN, and I presume that one theory that Andrei maybe didn't mention might be precisely that there are some massive cyber attacks going on. Just the defense is significantly better, and it might be better thanks to the international support. I want to hope that the help that Ukraine is getting from the Brits is making a difference. I strongly believe that, and I presume that it is not just the UK helping Ukraine in this regard, but it might be also the US and perhaps some other countries. When it comes to the lack of disinformation that Andrei mentioned, I'm afraid I will have to disagree with him a little bit. I do think that the Russian disinformation is alive and well and constantly going on. Every organization following Russian disinfo is actually showing it that there is still quite a lot of Russian disinformation, be it the regular reports by EU versus Disinfo or my other previous team, Digital Forensic Research Lab. The opinion polls showing that there are significant parts of European population believing Russian lies about who is to blame for the war in Ukraine are showing that the disinformation campaign has an impact on European audiences. I believe that there might be a small deception in the fact that we do not see some new tactics, some new flashy objects that would catch our attention, and it is pretty much still the same disinformation campaign that we saw ever since 2014, perhaps just a bit more or significantly more aggressive in tonality, more genocidal, more hateful, but it's still the same narratives about Ukrainians not being a nation, Ukraine not being a country. But I do think that this is actually part of the effectivity of disinformation campaigns. There is this old law: you have to repeat a lie 100 times, and only then it becomes the truth. There was an article by Medusa. I think like 2 weeks ago, they got hold of some of these metodichki, these documents that are telling the pseudo media in Russia what they should report about, how they should report about this. And one of their respondents mentioned that it is actually still the same propaganda. They haven't come up with anything new. They just repeat what they repeated for the past few years. So I would agree that we don't see much new, but I would disagree that the disinformation hasn't really, or the disinformation networks haven't been activated. I think they have been activated, and I think we see them quite active. If we have someone like Elon Musk with his dozens of millions of followers repeating Russian delusional plans about a peace, I do consider it quite a big success of Russian disinformation.
If I may add, unless you might want to comment on that.
Oh, no, I was just going to prompt you if you wanted to say anything.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add on this because you just mentioned this, the latest news regarding British intelligence services and the role that they played in terms of helping Ukraine from Russian cyber attacks since February. I was absolutely not surprised to see something like that because the United Kingdom really takes cybersecurity very seriously. And they openly even talk about both defensive and offensive measures, et cetera, et cetera. But more importantly, this is only the latest news because foreign intelligence have been instrumental even in warning about this invasion prior to February. Even the United States sent its own mission in Ukraine for cybersecurity before. But Jakub also mentioned something recently, what happened also in Montenegro, which is a NATO member state, and Russia was accused of such a cyber attack. Immediately, France, the United Kingdom, if I'm not mistaken, but certainly the United States immediately jumped in and helped, in cybersecurity efforts. So there is more and more cooperation in this field. And the second thing regarding cybersecurity, what I just mentioned in my opening remarks, the reason why everyone expected to have even attacks on American critical infrastructure, and probably the reason why we haven't seen something like that is also because of numerous preventive and defensive measures that the United States have taken since February. Again, cybersecurity operates in deceptive form, so we really don't know even what's behind this and what's happening and the details. And I cannot emphasize enough, the less we know, the better in this field. In terms of disinformation campaigns, I really have to echo Jakub's argument that I think disinformation campaigns are live and well. Maybe here people on Twitter will not believe that the United States is currently waging a biological war using mosquitoes or using migratory birds to deliver bioweapons. But I'm quite, certain that there are numerous people across the globe who do believe in bioweapons disinformation campaigns, because that's something that I've been tracking quite thoroughly. While everyone is focusing on this in 2022, this has been going around intensively, even in 2021, let alone this whole campaign is just mirroring what Russia was also doing during the Cold War, something that was called like a Denver campaign, basically accusing the United States of operating bioweapons and HIV, and specifically targeting African population. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this, even when it comes to monkeypox outbreak, Russia was very much involved in this disinformation campaigns. They were specifically targeting people on TikTok, young people, LGBT community, and the whole thing started with disinformation. Even that was stated by the Russian government, by the Russian Minister of Defense, that the United States actually was operating biolabs in Africa related to monkeypox. And then they added to the whole thing the real story, which was last year there was a Munich conference with a simulation of monkeypox. So this is 100% real story. And that simulation actually explained like that there will be an outbreak in 2022. I think they specifically stated even May, and they will kill several 100 million people. Like very, very detailed. So they connected the two things, and it was a full offensive information operations on behalf of the Russian government related to disinformation campaigns. And it's not only that. I also emphasized Africa, and I cannot really emphasize enough why we should actually care what's happening in that information space related to the food crisis, because that might actually lead to further social unrest that can actually lead to further protests, and maybe even the flow of refugees that can actually destabilize Europe. So we really need to think about this in a more holistic way, because Russia has been also weaponizing refugee crisis. Russia has been weaponizing also different secessionist movements that were all followed by heavy disinformation campaigns. So I would not say that that Russia has stopped doing that. I also think that Russia is right now adapting its information operations. For example, I'm even observing on Twitter Russian trolls and bots that operate with Ukrainian flags. So that's also something that we really need to pay attention to, let alone Russian disinformation campaign regarding Russophobia. What Jakub also mentioned, appealing to not only the far right groups, but I'm also observing to the far left groups. So they are really operating in this because that's the best way for them, to attack the West using asymmetric measures. I think, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, what European Union and United Kingdom, and specifically the United States, did after February in terms of defensive measures, it's already enough. It's a step in the right direction, but it's not enough. I think we really need to do more, and we need to put Russia on defense and information space. I've been writing about this. There is actually a pin article on my profile regarding how the United States should actually wage psychological warfare and challenge Russia on this thing, because we are constantly in a reactive mode. What happened, for example, last week related to a dirty bomb, you will, for example, today see significantly less news related to a dirty bomb. And the reason for that is because Russia is constantly putting information to feed us with certain narratives, and we are constantly responding to that instead of actually putting Russia on defense in the information space. So I will stop here, and I'm more than happy to later expand on any of those examples that I've just used.
Absolutely. Definitely very, very worrying activities there in the disinformation space. And I want to turn to Andre, who has done work looking at the surveillance state within Russia with his book, The Red Web, from a few years ago. Not only, I know, has Russia been involved in disinformation operations, turned outward, they've also been involved in that throughout the conflict in Ukraine, targeting their own domestic audience. I wondered, Andre, if you can dig into some of the disinformation that's been aimed at the Russian population since the start of this.
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to say thank you to Ivana, and I think she's absolutely right pointing out to Africa. It is extremely important what is going on out there, and I think there we see some real activities by Russian trolls, and we all need to pay attention to that. But at the same time, I just wanted to refer to a recent report published by Facebook that the Russian campaign, the disinformation campaign, was extremely clumsy, which surprised lots of experts. I would say it's not on the level you would expect from the country which believes to be in an existential war. It's just not that level. At the same time, you're absolutely right. The domestic audience is what the Kremlin cares a lot. And we see that the main battlefield seems to be Telegram. And it is one of the very few social media which is not blocked by the Russian authorities, and for a reason. Unfortunately, on Telegram, we have I would say an enormous community of people who actually are extremely supportive of the war. We have very popular voices. You can talk about so-called military correspondents or just military veterans. All of them are extremely radical, and they are promoting a very radical agenda that the Russian army should not stop with Donbass and Luhansk. They should go after Kiev. They should invade the whole of the country, maybe to go to Moldova and so on and so forth. So far, and the problem is that these voices, pro-war voices, are way more popular than the voices of my colleagues, independent journalists, and critics of the Kremlin. And that's probably the reason why Telegram has not been blocked. But there is some good news on this front, and it is exactly about censorship and internet filtering. The system which was built, especially recently, the so-called sovereign internet system, which is much more sophisticated than what was in place from 2011 to 2018, 19 maybe, and it's based on Western technologies of DPI, deep packet inspection. Nevertheless, we see that right now this system is a big failure, mostly because of mobilization. So the problem is that when Putin started his mobilization, that affected every region, every town, every city in the country. And the system which the Russian censors have in place was designed to deal with a crisis in 1-2 particular regions. And the idea was to have technical means to cut off traffic from this particular region and prevent the harmful content from spreading to the rest of the country. But because right now we have people affected everywhere, that is why the system cannot cope with this kind of crisis. It's a national crisis, and that is why we see all these videos of angry men and crying women all over the internet. It's about Telegram, it's about YouTube, it's about TikTok, it's about Kentucky. It looks like Russian censors, they just do not know what to do, and they are making mistakes. Just 2 days ago, they tried to block Telegram, and I blocked it. That sent some confusing message about the reason. We have people like Prigozhin, the famous or infamous chef of Putin, who is also in charge of Wagner, private military company, calling to block YouTube completely because it seems that the strategy they had in place didn't work. And this is a good news. That's where I'll stop probably.
And of course, our other speakers, Ivana and Jakob, can speak to this, but I also want to pose a looking forward question as the winter approaches, as this conflict grinds on. What are you expecting to see in the disinformation space, such as, I think, Ivana, you mentioned disinformation around agricultural output. What about issues with oil and gas and energy, given that that's such a crisis in Europe right now? What do you think that Russia will latch onto towards both international and domestic audiences?
So Russia has already setting informational conditions for chaos in Europe, and that's something that for Russia, this war is a long game, and the part of it, they understand that certain countries in the West can be easily deterred in their mind. So, for example, in Germany, what I've observed. Everything was related to the food crisis and to the energy crisis, and how the Germans will starve and how Germans will freeze this winter. And such disinformation campaigns have been already launched several months ago, and they're still live and quite well. So that's really nothing new. It's not only Germany. We see different protests in France and elsewhere in the West. So that's number one thing. Second thing, what I want to emphasize, I think it's not only related to the food crisis and energy crisis. I think we also have to pay attention to inflation in 2023 and how that will actually impact decision-making processes of the Western countries. Because in the West, I mean, unlike in Russia, where you do not have to worry about being reelected, in the West, you also need to listen to your to your voters. And politicians do understand that having such a pressure might actually cost them their political careers. And that's something that Russia is counting on by polarizing the West, by triggering these fears related to existential threats, related to food, related to freezing in Europe this winter, related to serious economic unrests. So that's something that I think we are already seeing, but I think we can actually expect even more within the next few months. And I cannot really emphasize enough why it is important to counter such disinformation campaigns. Look, I have to emphasize that while it's very important, for example, to publish long reports explaining all these things in detail, I do read those reports, and I'm quite confident to say that even Jakub or Andre are reading. But I'm actually wondering whether an average citizen in any of those countries are actually reading such reports. Having said that, I think we need to be more innovative when it comes to countering Russian disinformation campaigns. I do understand that we in the West, we have certain values, we are democracies, we cannot spread lies, but the truth is really on our side. And number one thing is actually to help people understand that Russia is using information as the weapon. And Russian military, Shoigu openly stated this several years ago. Basically, information is the weapon, and Russian military is openly talking about that. We in the West, we feel quite uncomfortable even understanding and talking openly about information warfare. So the more people are aware of it, the more there will be, the more they will understand the process, how they operate. The second thing is, again, how do you counter Russian information even on social media? You really just have to go and take a look at the Russian embassy of South Africa. In my view, they are running the most successful information campaigns because their posts are very emotional. They're full of emojis. They're very funny. And the real question is whether governments in the West are willing to take such risks to deliver such messages to their own audience, or even to counter Russian information space for the international audience by risking their reputation. And these are all very important questions that we really need to think about from a higher perspective on how to really go about this. Because, countering one by one message, it's not really going to help. And Russia has, as I mentioned, been using this for decades. The United States stopped investing heavily in informational operations after the end of the Cold War. Russia never stopped doing that. They're using both on operational and tactical levels. So I think it's really high time for the West to go back to one of the most powerful tools and to do something in information space when it comes to soft power. So I'm going to stop here.
That's an interesting take. Jakub, I wanted to ask for your thoughts on what we can expect to see in the disinformation space, particularly focused at the EU, which I know has been an area of expertise for you in the past.
Thanks. Yeah, I expect patience. I think that's the key word in any communication campaign. And I think Russia will hope that over a period of time, the narratives they are spreading will gain more traction and populations will start listening to them. And once there is a bigger part of the population listening to them, some politicians will start reflecting on that. Let me just remind once again, if we have like 1/3 of Slovakia, mid-sized European country, believing Russian lies about the West being to blame for the war in Ukraine, not the country that actually amassed dozens of thousands of soldiers around the border and that is bombing maternity wards and raping children in the country. They can really persuade these people about absolutely anything. Perhaps that their prime minister should be a far-right lunatic. The effects of disinformation do take time. It's even something that the old Chekists, the old officials of the KGB used to say, that it is like a drop of water falling on a stone. It does not make difference because of its force, but it makes a difference because of being persistent. And I think Russians can see some openings. I am Czech, which has had recently some protests in Prague. Some of them were making me quite happy. Some of them were for Ukraine and for keeping the course that is supporting the victim against the aggressor. But still, the protests that were calling to end the war and to start buying cheap Russian gas, they still managed to amass dozens of thousands of people. That's not exactly insignificant. The mood in Slovakia also doesn't really fill me with optimism. And if we have snap elections where it currently looks like some pro-Russian politicians might become significantly stronger than they are now, the situation in the Balkans is also not exactly super optimistic. I think Russia will continue pushing these narratives. Russia will continue supporting and elevating and amplifying the European far left and far right. And again, looking at various EU countries, looking at the elections in these countries, I don't think we can be very calm. I think we see quite a lot of advocates of Russian and pro-Russian policies being quite strong in Europe. Ivana mentioned that we need to be more innovative in countering disinformation. I really couldn't agree more. For those of you who are interested in this topic, please see my pinned tweet with my recent report on countering disinformation. And I talk about these 4 lines of countering disinformation. And the 4th one is limiting, punishing, and deterring of the information aggressors. And it is really infuriating for me to see the news, for example, from last week. I believe it was published by Politico, that Россия Сегодня, the Russian state media group, is still allowed to do business with US companies that spread content on their behalf. I mean, how come that these organizations are still not sanctioned? I was calling for sanctioning them ever since I left Brussels and I could start speaking openly. These sanctions should have these organizations should have been sanctioned for years, and yet, even in the middle of the war, they still funnel millions to U.S. companies that produce articles on their behalf. I do think that is really a very, very big problem. If it's not a too big problem, may I also have a question on Andrei, actually, more on the disinformation targeted at the Russians?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. You were describing some of the mistakes of Russian propagandists, and I was also wondering, I saw, I believe it was again in Medusa, one of these metodichkas, how they should cover the conscription, and it looked like the authorities are actually inciting the media to blame the local authorities for the problems. And that was precisely a moment for me where I thought, okay, so this really looks like a mistake. Why would you incite protests in your own country? This really doesn't look like you would keep the lid on the situation. So how would you explain these mistakes? Because this is something I don't think we have seen in the past 8 years when it really looked like a well-oiled machine. Is it just the pressure that the situation is not really going according to the plan? Or is it the fact that they got used to the fact that we can do everything we can do everything we want and nobody really opposes us and this kind of complacency starts building in? Or how would you explain these mistakes?
Well, I think that first of all, it's not completely unprecedented. We saw something like that during COVID times when the Kremlin blamed the local governors for mistakes, and that's exactly what we are trying to do now. Also, it's something about Putin's paranoia about popular governors, especially people like Sobyanin. We all know that Sobyanin, or at least that is a presumption, that Sobyanin is not extremely happy with the war, and he's a mayor of Moscow. He's not very popular, but I would say he's still considered to be quite powerful and important, and the problem is that at some moment he might pose a political threat, and that is why the idea is to blame local authorities in big cities, especially. And in this case, you don't see any political threats. You have only the Kremlin, which is fine. You have the military, which might be blamed for some minor mistakes, but only to some extent, and that's it. So I think it's, yes, it is a strategy, but unfortunately, it's not a sign of desperation. We are not there yet. And Regarding your question about what we can expect in the winter, well, the country is getting increasingly isolated, which means that we are dealing with two boxes, the domestic audience and international audience, and they are almost completely separated. Domestically, I would say the message from the Kremlin and from the military is getting even more aggressive than it was. And again, it's all about the memories of the Second World War. So now we have this message that, look, because Ukrainians, they are attacking us with terrorist attacks. So we need to respond by destroying the all infrastructure in the country with massive airstrikes and whatever you have. It's also something about the new narrative is that that there is not such a thing as a good Ukrainian. We are not liberating them anymore. There are only bad Ukrainians. Just like during the Second World War, when we had this famous and horrible article written by Ilya Ehrenburg, who's, with the title, the headline, "Killed the German." And so they are trying to, again, to play on these feelings, on these memories of the Second World War, trying to present the entire population of Ukraine as actually dehumanizing the whole country. But internationally, I would say the message is it's something different. Of course, you cannot sell to the international audience all these horrible messages about killing and destroying the civilian infrastructure in the country. But what you can do, what we're trying to do now, we're trying to play with the word escalation. We all know that many European countries and governments are not happy with the idea that the war might escalate beyond the Ukrainian borders. And we all are aware of a nuclear threat here. The problem is that the Kremlin also knows that. So what they're trying to do right now, they're trying to portray Zelensky as the guy in the room who actually is escalating. So every attack on Ukrainian soil, we see that the Kremlin is trying to portray as an escalation, and Russian attacks as something as a response measure. And of course, it might work to some extent because people are afraid and people are frightened about the prospect of a nuclear attack. And if you constantly push for this message that it is Zelensky who is not ready to negotiate with Putin, and Putin is ready to sit and have a discussion or whatever, and that would help people in the West who might think that 8 months is already enough to stop thinking and talking about the prospect of some sort of conversation, because nobody wants this escalation. So I think what we could expect maybe in a month's time, maybe in 2 months' time, is is a big conversation about how to avoid this escalation and how to try to reach some sort of agreement. And that will be pushed by the Kremlin, that's for sure.
And as we could really speak about disinformation and information operations from Russia all day, but I want to quickly pivot back to the cyber angle of this. And I know that the war in Ukraine has really galvanized a lot of international work around cybercrime, around trying to create more of a unified front to push back against this. And one way that has been ongoing since before the conflict is EU work on a cybercrime treaty. Ivana, I know you are part of this effort to negotiate it. I wondered if you could give an update on how the war in Ukraine has maybe channeled this effort to move faster, or what the impact has been, and where we are on creating this international treaty around cybercrime that could have such an impact on future conflicts after this.
Certainly, I'm happy to explain this, but can I just literally say just one sentence why we should actually care about how Russia perceives information warfare, because Russia just recently added Meta to the list of terrorist and extremist groups, yet the Russian government perfectly operates on all Meta platforms. So that's something also to think about related to great Andrei's presentation on how actually the West should respond, because that's a hypocrisy that they are listed as a terrorist and extremist groups, as you know, they operate that. Now, going back on international efforts to regulate cyber crimes. So if there are people who believe in realism and who do not believe in the United Nations, I still firmly believe that you should stay to listen to my short presentation on this topic, because this particular treaty has nothing to do with international law. It has nothing to do with how this particular treaty will prevent cyber crimes. But this is a perfect example on how Russia actually is exploiting international organizations. So the irony is that Russia has been behind numerous cyber attacks in the West, yet Russia has been trying to regulate cybercrime globally since 1998. And even Moscow refused to sign the 2001 Budapest Convention on Cybercrime because allegedly it threatened Russia's digital sovereignty. And that's something that Andrei perfectly explained, why Russia actually cares about international sovereignty. So in 2018, both the United States and Russia put forward two different resolutions in the United Nations trying to regulate cyber crimes globally. The United States lost a bit, particularly because the United States during the Trump administration had a very isolationist approach in international organizations, which was a perfect moment for Russia to step in and to take advantage of this. And there were numerous, problems since then. But now, actually, they found a solution. So there is a new resolution going on in the United Nations that is supposed to regulate cybercrime. Who doesn't want cybercrimes to be regulated in international arena, right? It's such an admirable goal, but there is a problem. The problem is that this particular treaty, if you read it carefully, which should be actually adopted starting in 2023 with more work. The problem is that it's really written based on Russian understanding of information security. And even the words that they use are very, very much based on the first Russian resolution. So just to give you an idea why I'm very concerned about this particular treaty, it is because this particular treaty that was initially put by Russia, supported by China, can actually legitimize how those authoritarian regimes can actually use such a treaty to violate freedom of expression and to target dissidents. And they would love to see international arena when it comes to cybersecurity and cyber crimes to look something after Putin's sovereign internet law, which basically allow Russia to restrict social media platforms in order to protect Russia's digital sovereignty. This law theoretically, for example, allows Russia to impose fines on any platforms. They do not block like a forbidden content such as, calls for genocide, child pornography, on information on drug use, which is great, right? But the problem is that they're often invoked when Western social media platforms do not bend to the will of the Kremlin. So even earlier this year, Putin signed additional legislation threatening actual prison for those who oppose government talking points on the war in Ukraine. They would love to see both Russia and China further implementation and justification for their homegrown RUNET or Golden Shield project. I know that Andrei was writing before about RUNET and all the technical problems that it has. So I think we really need to ask a question why Russia actually cares about the United Nations at this point. And that is because Russia does not believe that this particular cybercrime will prevent cybercrimes globally. Rather, they're using international organizations to rally their allies and to spread narratives on a broader agenda. while I'm very concerned about this thing, I still have a little bit of hope because of the war in Ukraine, and Russia just lost the numerous votes for seats in the United Nations. So let's hope, that there will be new edits on this particular treaty. And I think the West should rally like-minded nations that support an open and free internet to push back against this Russian and Chinese authoritarian bloc. I think during the negotiations, we need to insist on narrowing down even the definition of cybercrime, so it does not become a facade for Sino-Russian free speech witch hunt. And I think, Russia has and China both have sought to control international organizations via working groups. And I think, the US and like-minded nations need to raise awareness of this manipulation via the open and the working group. So we still have time to do something about this. I was significantly more concerned a few months ago. I do still have hope that with further edits, with further raising awareness of how Russia and China have been using this treaty, we can actually prevent this treaty to actually protect digital human rights.
Thank you for the update. Definitely something to watch. And I know we only have a few minutes left in this Twitter Spaces. So I may start with you, Jakob, and then go to Andre and Ivana. If you have any closing thoughts about, what Russia has carried out in the disinformation and cyberspace so far, what you might expect to see, and any sort of thoughts you wish to express on this. So I suppose we'll start with Jakob, just for about a minute for each of you, because I know we are running quite short on time.
Understood. Thanks. When it comes to the problem of Russian disinformation, I'm afraid many European decision makers love to hear that something is not a problem anymore, and they need not care. So I really want to emphasize that the war, both the kinetic war in Ukraine, but also the information war, it is still not won. We still mustn't underestimate the situation, and we still need more action against disinformers, the disinformation individuals or disinformation organizations. We need more sanctions against the disinformers so that Russian media groups like Россия Сегодня couldn't be doing business in the United States and spreading their toxic content there. And so that Western companies couldn't be doing business with Russian media, and so that we wouldn't see any advertisements on Russian state TV financing the anti-Western propaganda machine. So my main message would be that we still need to do a lot more in countering disinformation.
Andre, closing thoughts?
Yeah, very quickly. I'm risking to be extremely unpopular here, but I think we need to remember that there is a problem and there is a risk to accept the idea of censorship here, even given the fact that disinformation is a big threat. Nevertheless, we need to understand, and we need to remember some history here, that for many, many years, I would say for 20 years, there was always big dispute between the Russian politicians and, say, Americans and Brits about how to describe security in cyberspace. And the Americans and Europeans always wanted to talk about cybersecurity, and the Russians wanted to talk about information security, precisely because Russians wanted to regulate content. We wanted to control the information. Unfortunately, after 2016, we see that lots of people in the West also accepted the idea that, look, information actually might be a problem. It might be a threat. And it is, unfortunately. We all see that. We just need to remember that censorship is something which is really easy to accept if you feel that you are under threat. And we still and should be very aware of this risk.
And Ivana, you get the last word.
So my closing remark would be that we still face a serious threat coming from Russian information security capabilities, and we need to take it seriously. As I mentioned earlier, I cannot emphasize enough how it is important to treat information as the weapon. Information is not some part of, random disinformation, propaganda, etc. Information is the weapon, and we should treat it as such. And my last thing that I would like to emphasize, while it is very, very important to counter Russia in information space using numerous, defensive measures, I think it's really high time for the West to also counter Russian information space using offensive information capabilities. So I will stop here.
All right. Well, thank you so much to our panelists today. I, as a cybersecurity reporter and someone who covers disinformation, I could honestly continue this discussion happily for hours. But unfortunately, we are time limited. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for listening, and to SIPA for hosting. Have a great day to everyone.